Part 3 of Citadel of Lost Ships by Leigh Brackett. This librivox recording is in the public domain. Part 3. He retained no very clear memory of the trip. Once, when he was quite low, a spaceship blazed by over him, heading toward Leigh. There were still about 8 hours darkness over the swamps. He landed, eventually, in a clearing he was pretty sure only he knew about. He'd used it before when he'd had stuff to fence in Leigh, and wasn't sure who owned the town at the time. He'd learned to be careful about those things. There was a ship there now, a smallish trader of the interlunar type. He stared at it, not really believing it was there. Then, just in time, he got the helmet off. When the world stopped turning over, he was lying with his head in Stella Moore's lap. She had changed her tunic for plain spaceman's black, and it made her face look whiter and lovelier in its frame of black hair. Her lips were still sullen and still red. Campbell sat up and kissed them. He felt much better. Not good, but he thought he'd live. Stella laughed and said, "Well, you're recovering." He said, "Sister, you're good medicine for anything." A hand which he recognized as Mara's materialized out of the indigo gloom. It had a flask in it. Campbell accepted it gladly. Presently, the icy deadness around his stomach thawed out, and he could see things better. He got up rather unsteadily and fumbled for a cigarette. His shirt had been mostly blown and charred off of him, and his hands hurt like hell. Stella gave him a smoke and a light. He sucked it in gratefully and said, "Okay, kids, are we all ready?" They were. Campbell led off. He drained the flask and was pleased to find himself firing on all jets again. He felt empty and relaxed and ready for anything. He hoped the liquor wouldn't wear off too soon. There was a path threaded through the hammocks, the bogs, and potholes and reeds, and Leigh trees. Only Campbell, who had made it, could have followed it. Remembering his blind stumbling in the mazes of Romany, he felt pleased about that. He said, rather smugly, "Be careful not to slip. How'd you fix the getaway?" Mara made a grim little laugh. Romany was a madhouse hunting for you. Some of the hot-headed boys started minor wars over policy on top of that. Tradick had to use most of his men to keep order. Besides, of course, he thought we were beaten on the Kralin question. There were only 4 men guarding the lock, said Stella. Mara and a couple of the Paniki boys took care of them. Campbell remembered the spaceship flashing toward Leigh. He told them about it. Could be Tradick coming to supervise our defeat in person. Defeat? It was because he was a little tight, of course, but he didn't think anyone could beat him this night. He laughed. Something rippled out of the indigo night to answer his laughter. Something so infinitely sweet and soft that it made him want to cry, and then shocked him with the deep and iron power in it. Campbell looked back over his shoulder. He thought, "Me? Hell, these are the guys who'll do it if it's done." Stella was behind him. Beyond her was a thin, small man with 4 arms. He wore no clothing but his own white fur, and his head was crowned with feathery antennae. Even in the blue night, the antennae in the man's eyes burned living scarlet. He came from Callisto, and he carried in his 4 hands a thing vaguely like a harp, only the strings were doubly banked. It was the harp that had spoken. Campbell hoped it would never speak against him. Mara brought up the rear, swinging along with no regard for the burden he wore. Over his naked shoulder, Campbell could see the still white face of the Baraki from Titan, the little father who had saved them from the hunters. There were tentacles around Mara's big body like white ropes. 4 gypsies and a public enemy. 5 little people against the Terro-Venusian coalition. It didn't make sense. A hot, slow wind stirred the Leigh trees. Campbell breathed it in and grinned. "What does?" he wondered, and stooped to part a tangle of branches. There was a stone-lined tunnel beyond. "Here we go, children. Join hands and make like little mousies." He took Stella's hand in his left. Because it was Stella's, he didn't mind the way it hurt. In his right, he held his gun. He led them quickly and quietly along the disused branch of an old drainage system that he had used so often as a private entrance. Presently, they dropped to a lower level and the conduit system proper. When the rains were on, the drains would be running full. Now they were only pumping seepage. They waited in pitch darkness, bypassed a pumping station through a side tunnel once used for coal storage by one of Leighy's cautious businessmen, and then found steep, slippery steps going up. "Careful," whispered Campbell. He stopped them on a narrow ledge and stood listening. The Callistan murmured with faint amusement, "There is no one beyond." Antenna over ears. Campbell grinned and found a hidden spring. "Leigh is full of these things," he said. "The boys used to keep their little wars going just for fun, and every smart guy had several bolt holes. Maps used to sell high." They emerged in a very deep, very dark cellar. It was utterly still. Campbell felt a little sad. He could remember when Martian Mox was the busiest thieves' market in Leigh, and a man could hear the fighting even here. He smiled bitterly and led the way upstairs. Presently they looked down on the main gate, the main square, and the slave pens of Leigh. The surrounding streets were empty, the buildings mostly dark. The Coalition had certainly cleaned up when it took over the town. It was horribly depressing. Campbell pointed. "Reception committee." Pradick radioed anyway. "One'll get you 20. He followed it up in person." The gate was floodlighted over a wide area, and there were a lot of tough-looking men with heavy-duty needle guns. In this day of anesthetic charges, you could do a lot of effective shooting without doing permanent damage. There were more lights and more men by the slave pens. Campbell couldn't see much over the high stone walls of the pens. Vague movement, the occasional flash of a brilliant crest. He had known the Kralins would be there. It was the only place in Leigh where you could imprison a lot of people and be sure of keeping them. Campbell's dark face was cruel. "Okay," he said. "Let's go." Down the stone steps to the entrance. Stella's quick breathing in the hot darkness. The rhythmic clink of the bosses on Mara's kilt. Campbell saw the eyes of the Callistian Harper glowing red and angry. He realized he was sweating. He had forgotten his burns. Stella opened the heavy steel-sheathed door. Quietly, slowly. The Baraki whispered, "Put me down." Mara set him gently on the stone floor. He folded in upon himself, tentacles around white rubbery flesh. His single eye burned with a cold phosphorescence. He whispered, "Now." The Callistan Harper went to the door. Reflected light painted him briefly. White fur and scarlet crest and outlandish harp, and the glowing, angry eyes. He vanished. Out of nowhere the harp began to sing. Through the partly open door, Campbell had a clear view of the square and the gate. In all that glare of light on empty stone, nothing moved. And yet the music rippled out. The guards. Campbell could see the startled glitter of their eyeballs in the light. There was nothing to shoot at. The harping was part of the night, as all-enveloping and intangible. Campbell shivered. A pulse beat like a trip hammer under his jaw. Stella's voice came to him, a faint breath out of the darkness. "The Baraki is shielding him with thought, a wall of force that turns the light." The edge of the faint light touched her cheek, the blackness of her hair. Mara crouched beyond her, motionless. His hook glinted dully, curved and cruel. They were getting only the feeble backwash of the harping. The Callistan was aiming his music outward. Campbell felt it sweep and tremble, blend with the hot, slow wind and the indigo sky. It was some trick of vibrations, some diabolical thrusting of notes against the brain like fingers to press and control. Something about the double-banked strings thrumming against each other under the cunning of four skilled hands. But it was like witchcraft. "The harp of Dagda," whispered Stella Moore, and the Irish music in her voice was older than time. The Scot in Campbell answered it. Somewhere outside a man cursed, thickly, like one drugged with sleep and afraid of it. A gun went off with a sharp slapping sound. Some of the guards had fallen down. The harp sang louder, throbbing along the gray stones. It was the slow wind, the heat, the deep blue night. It was sleep. The floodlights blazed on empty stone, and the guards slept. The baraki sighed and shivered and closed his eye. Campbell saw the Callistan harper standing in the middle of the square, his scarlet crest erect, striking the last thrumming note. Campbell straightened, catching his breath in a ragged sob. Mara picked up the baraki. He was limp like a tired child. Stella's eyes were glistening and strange. Campbell went out ahead of them. It was a long way across the square, in the silence and the glaring lights. Campbell thought the harp was a nice weapon. It didn't attract attention because everyone who heard it slept. He flung back the 3 heavy bars of the slave gate. The pain of his burned hands jarred him out of the queer mood the harping and his Celtic blood had put on him. He began to think again. "Hurry!" he snarled at the Kraelins. "Hurry up!" They came pouring out of the gate. Men, women with babies, little children. Their crests burned in the sullen glare. Campbell pointed to Mara. "Follow him." They recognized him, tried to speak, but he cursed them on. And then an old man said, "My son." Campbell looked at him and then down at the stones. "For God's sake, Father, hurry." A hand touched his shoulder gently. He looked up again and grinned. He couldn't see anything. "Get the hell on, will you?" Somebody found the switch, and the nearer lights went out. The hand pressed his shoulder and was gone. He shook his head savagely. The Kraelins were running now toward the house. And then, suddenly, Mara yelled. Men were running into the square. 8 or 10 of them, probably the bodyguard of the burly gray-haired man who led them. Beside the gray-haired man was Tradick, over-chief of the Terran quarter of Romany. They were startled. They hadn't been expecting this. Campbell's battle-trained eye saw that. Probably they had been making a routine tour of inspection and just stumbled onto the crash-out. Campbell fired from the hip. Anesthetic needles sprayed into the close-packed group. 2 of them went down. The rest scattered, dropping flat. Campbell wished there had been time to kill the gate lights. At least the shadows made shooting tricky. He bent over and began to run, guarding the rear of the Kraelin's line. Stella, in the cover of the doorway, was laying down a methodical wall of needles. Campbell grinned. Some of the Kraelins caught it and had to be carried. That slowed things down. Campbell's gun clicked empty. He shoved in another clip, cursing his burned fingers. A charge sang by him, close enough to stir his hair. He fired again, blanketing the whole sector where the men lay. He wished he could blow Tradick's head off. The Kraelins were vanishing into the house. Mara and the Callistan had gone ahead, leading them. Campbell groaned. Speed was what they needed. Speed! A child, separated from his mother in the rush, knelt on the stones and shrieked. Campbell picked him up and ran on. Enemy fire was slackening. Stella was doing all right. The last of the Kralins shoved through the door. Campbell bounded up the steps. Stella got up off her belly and smiled at him. Her eyes shone. They were halfway through the door when the cold voice said behind them, "There are lethal needles in my gun. You had better stop." Campbell turned slowly. His face was wooden. Tradick stood at the bottom of the steps. He must have crawled around the edge of the square where the shadows were thick under the walls. "Drop your gun, Campbell. And you, Stella Moore." Campbell dropped it. Tradick might be bluffing about those needles, but a Mickey at this stage of the game would be just as fatal. Stella's gun clattered beside him. She didn't say anything, but her face was coldly murderous. Tradick said evenly, "You might as well call them back, Campbell. You led them in, but you're not going to lead them out." It was funny, Campbell thought, how a man's voice could be so cold when its eyes had fire in them. He said sullenly, "Okay, Tradick, you win. But what's the big idea behind this?" Tradick's face might have been cut from granite except for the feral eyes. "I was born on Romany. I froze and starved in those rotten hulks. I hated it. I hated the darkness, the loneliness, the uncertainty. But when I said I hated it, I got a beating. Everybody else thought it was worth it. I didn't. They talked about freedom, but Romany was a prison to me. I wanted to grow, and I was stifled inside it. Then I got an idea. If I could rule Romany and make a treaty with the Coalition, I'd have money and power, and I could fix it so no more kids would be brought up that way, cold and hungry and scared. Mara opposed me, and then the Kralins became an issue." Tradick smiled, but there was no mirth or softness in it. "It's a good thing. The Coalition can take care of Mara and you others who were mixed up in this. My way is clear." Stella Moore said softly between her teeth, "They'll never forgive you for turning Romany people over to the Lotniks. There'll be war." Tradick nodded soberly. "No great change is made without bloodshed. I'm sorry for that. But Romany will be happier. We don't ask to be happy. We only ask to be free." Campbell said wearily, "Stella, take the kid, will you?" He held out the little Kralin, droopy and quiet now. She looked at him in quick alarm. His feet were spread but not steady, his head sunk forward. She took the child. Campbell's knees sagged. One seared arm in a tattered green sleeve came up to cover his face. The other groped blindly along the wall. He dropped rather slowly to his knees. The groping hand fell across the gun by Stella's foot. In one quick sweep of motion, Campbell got it, threw it, and followed it with his own body. The gun missed, but it came close enough to Tradick's face to make him move his head. The involuntary muscular contraction of his whole body spoiled his aim. The charge went past Campbell into the wall. They crashed down together on the stones. Campbell gripped Tradick's wrist, knew he couldn't hold it, let go with one hand, and slashed backward with his elbow at Tradick's face. The gun let off again, harmlessly. Tradick groaned. His arm was weaker. Campbell thrashed over and got his knee on it. Tradick's other fist was savaging his already tortured body. Campbell brought his fist down into Tradick's face. He did it twice, and wept and cursed because he was suddenly too weak to lift his arm again. Tradick was bleeding, but far from out. His gun was coming up again. He didn't have much play, but enough. Campbell set his teeth. He couldn't even see Tradick, but he swung again. He never knew whether he connected or not. Something thrummed past his head. He couldn't say he heard it. It was more like feeling. But it was something deadly and strange. Tradick didn't make a sound. Campbell knew suddenly that he was dead. He got up, very slow, shaking and cold. The Callistan Harper stood in the doorway. He was lowering his hands, and his eyes were living coals. He didn't say anything. Neither did Stella. But she laughed, and the child stirred and whimpered in her arms. Campbell went to her. She looked at him with queer eyes and whispered, "I called him with my mind. I knew he'd kill." He took her face in his two hands. "Listen, Stella, you've got to lead them back. You've got to touch my mind with yours and let me guide you that way back to the ship." Her eyes widened sharply. "But you can come. He's dead. You're free now." "No." He could feel her throat quiver under his hands. Her blood was beating. So was his. He said harshly, "You fool. Do you think they'll let you get away with this? You're tackling the Coalition. They can't afford to look silly. They've got to have a scapegoat, something to save face. Romany so far is beyond planetary control. Slap your tractors on her, tow her out, clear out to Saturn if you have to. Nobody saw the Callistan. Nobody saw anybody but me and the Kralins and an unidentifiable somebody up here on the porch. Nobody, that is, but Tradick, and he won't talk. Do you understand?" She did, but she was still rebellious. Her sullen lips were angry, her eyes bright with tears and challenging. "But you, Roy?" He took his hands away. "Damn you, woman! If I hide out on Romany, I bring you into Space Guard jurisdiction. I'll be trapped, and Romany's last chance to stay free will be gone." She said stubbornly, "But you can get away. There are ships." "Oh, sure. But the Kralins are there. You can't hide them. The Coalition will search Romany. They'll ask questions. I tell you, they've got to have a goat." He was really weak now. He hoped he could hold out. He hoped he wouldn't do anything disgraceful. He turned away from her, looking out at the square. Some of the guards were beginning to stir. "Will you go?" he said. "Will you get the hell out?" She put her hand on him. "Roy—" He jerked away. His dark face was set and cruel. "Do you have to make it harder? Do you think I want to rot on Phobos in their stinking mines with shackles on my feet?" He swung around, challenging her with savage eyes. "How else do you think Romany is going to stay free? You can't go on playing cat and mouse with the big shots this way. They're getting sick of it. They'll pass laws and tie you down. Somebody's got to spread Romany all over the solar system. Somebody's got to pull a publicity campaign that'll make the great dumb public sit up and think. If public opinion's with you, you're safe." He smiled. "I'm big news, sister. I'm Roy Campbell. I can splash your lousy little mess of tin cans all over with glamour, so the great dumb public won't let a hair of your little head be hurt. If you want to, you can raise a statue to me in the council hall. And now, will you, for God's sake, go?" She wasn't crying. Her gray eyes had lights in them. "You're wonderful, Roy. I didn't realize how wonderful." He was ashamed then. "Nuts. In my racket you don't expect to get away with it forever. Besides, I'm an old dog. I know my way around. I have a little dough saved up. I won't be in for long." "I hope not," she said. "Oh, Roy, it's so stupid. Why do Earthmen have to change everything they lay their hands on?" He looked at Tradick lying on the stones. His voice came slow and somber. "They're building, Stella. When they're finished, they'll have a big, strong, prosperous world extending all across the planets, and the people who belong to that world will be happy. But before you can build, you have to grade and level, destroy the things that get in your way. We're the things, the trees, stumps, and the rocks that grew one way and can't be changed. They're building, Stella. They're growing. You can't stop that. In the end, it'll be a good thing, I suppose. But right now, for us... He broke off. He thrust her roughly inside and locked the steel-sheathed door. You've got to go now. It was dark and hot. The Kralian child whimpered. He could feel Stella close to him. He found her lips and kissed them. He said, "So long, kid. And about that statue, you'd better wait till I come back to pose for it." His voice became a longing whisper. "And I'll be back," he promised. End of Part 3. End of Citadel of Lost Ships by Leigh Douglas Brackett. The story recorded by Phil Chenevert. April of 2021.